She didn't cry at the funeral. Not once. Not when they lowered the casket. Not when the pastor read the 23rd Psalm. Not when her daughter pressed a small fist into the side of her knee and looked up at her with eyes that were too old for a 7-year-old's face. Lyra Monroe stood at the graveside in a black wool coat that cost more than her first car, and she did not cry, and nobody who worked for her said a word about it. That was 11 months ago. Now she sat in the back of a town car, moving through downtown Atlanta at 6:45 in the morning, reading acquisition briefs on a tablet she'd already read twice, and the driver didn't speak because he knew better, and the assistant in the front passenger seat had learned in her first week never to ask how Lyra was doing. The company was called Vela Systems. Lyra had built it in a studio apartment in Pittsburgh when she was 26 years old, eating peanut butter crackers for dinner because she'd spent her last paycheck on server costs. 17 years later, Vela was the third largest data infrastructure firm in the country, and Lyra sat on the boards of 2 federal technology commissions and had been on the cover of 3 magazines she never read. None of that mattered on the morning they called to tell her that her husband Marcus had died of a cardiac event at 41 years old on a Tuesday afternoon while she was in a meeting about cloud migration contracts in San Francisco. She had asked the caller to repeat themselves. Then she had gone back into the meeting and said she had a family emergency and left. And she had not cried until she was in the car alone, and then she had cried for exactly 12 minutes, and then she had stopped, and she had not cried since. The town car pulled up to the Vela building. The driver opened her door. Lyra stepped out with the tablet under her arm and walked inside without looking up. The problem, the real problem, the one she turned over in her mind at 3 in the morning when the rest of the house was quiet, was not Lyra. She knew how to function. She had been functioning her whole life through things most people wouldn't survive. Grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Macon, Georgia, with her grandmother and 2 cousins after her mother left and her father never came back. Learned how to be invisible when the situation called for it and impossible to ignore when it didn't. She knew how to get through things. The problem was Cleo. Cleo was 7, and she had stopped talking. Not entirely. She answered direct questions in school. She said please and thank you. She ate her breakfast and put her plate in the sink and did what she was told. But the conversations were gone. The long winding questions about why clouds had different shapes, the running commentary on everything she noticed, the way she used to narrate her own drawings out loud while she worked. All of it had stopped. The pediatrician said it was grief and that it was normal, and that children processed loss differently, and that Cleo just needed time. The child therapist said the same thing in different words. Lyra had hired the best people she could find, and all of them said, give her time. Lyra Monroe was not good at giving anything time. She had 3 nannies cycle through in the months after Marcus died. Not because she fired them. One left for another position. One relocated. One simply couldn't handle the hours. The agency sent a 4th, and then a 5th. The 5th one cried in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching, and Lyra thanked her for her service and called the agency again. The 6th one came on a Thursday morning in October. Her name was June Abernethy, and she was 43 years old, and she had worked with children for 19 years, and the agency said she was their most requested placement. She arrived at 7:15 with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a pair of reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a way of standing in a doorway that made her seem like she had always just come from somewhere interesting. Lyra met her in the front hall. She had exactly 20 minutes before her first call. The daily schedule is printed and on the kitchen counter, Lyra said. Cleo has therapy on Tuesdays and Fridays. She eats most things, but not mushrooms or anything with a strong smell. She's reading above her grade level, and she likes to draw, but she's been very quiet lately, and I don't want her pressured to talk. If she doesn't want to engage, let her not engage. June nodded once. She didn't write anything down, which Lyra noticed. I'll be on calls most of the morning. My assistant Renata is in the study if you need anything. How long has she been this quiet? June asked. It was not the question Lyra expected. She paused with her tablet in her hand. Since February, she said. June nodded again slowly, like she was filing something away. Okay, Lyra said and went to work. She did not expect anything. She had stopped expecting things. What happened instead was this. Nothing, for 6 days. June arrived each morning, and Cleo moved through the house on her own terms, and June did not push. She sat at the kitchen table and read while Cleo drew in the next room. She made breakfast and put it on the table, and didn't comment when Cleo ate half and then left. She said good morning every day, and for 6 days Cleo said it back in a voice that was technically present but pointed somewhere else. On the seventh day, Lyra came downstairs at 6 in the morning and found June sitting on the back porch steps with a mug of coffee, watching the yard. She was not on her phone. She was just sitting there in the early morning cold in a cardigan, looking at the oak tree at the back of the property. Lyra stood at the glass door for a moment before she pushed it open. "You're early," she said. "I'm always early." June looked over her shoulder. "There's coffee." Lyra got a mug and came out and stood near the railing. The yard was still half dark, the sky just beginning to lighten at the eastern edge. "She talked to you yesterday?" Lyra asked. A little June wrapped both hands around her mug. "She told me she doesn't like the way the oak tree looks in November. Said it looks like it forgot something." Lyra looked at the tree. The branches were bare and angular against the pale sky. "That sounds like her," she said, and it came out quieter than she meant it to. June didn't respond to that. She just drank her coffee, and the yard was still, and Lyra stayed on the porch for another 4 minutes before she went back inside. She wasn't sure what that had been. She told herself it was nothing. The meeting was in Chicago, 2 weeks after June started. A merger discussion that had been on the calendar since July. 4 days of sessions with attorneys and analysts, and the kind of men who scheduled everything in 15-minute increments. Lyra flew up on a Sunday night. She called home Tuesday evening from her hotel room, and Renata answered the house phone, which meant Cleo was already asleep. And Lyra thanked her and hung up and sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room for a while. She called June's cell instead. She wasn't sure why. She had never called a nanny's personal number before. The agency had a protocol for communications, and she had always used it. June answered on the second ring. "Ms. Monroe, is everything okay?" Everything's fine." She had a good day. Lyra stood up and walked to the window. 22 floors below, the city was lit and moving. "What does a good day look like now?" There was a pause in June's end. "Not a long one." She finished a drawing, June said. She'd been working on it for 3 days. When she finished, she held it up and looked at it for a minute, and then she put it on the refrigerator herself. She didn't ask anyone. She just decided it was good enough to go up. Lyra pressed her forehead to the glass. The city blurred a little. "She put it up herself," Lyra said. "She did. She used to ask Marcus whether things were good enough. She'd carry them around the house looking for him." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that. June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's still deciding what her own judgment is worth. That takes time. But she's working on it." Lyra said she'd let her go. She said thank you and hung up and sat back down on the edge of the bed, and she was fine. She was completely fine. She put the phone down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling and was fine for about 90 seconds, and then she put her hand over her mouth and held very still. She did not cry, but it was close. She started paying closer attention when she came home. She told herself it was practical. She was the CEO of a company and a single mother and the only adult responsible for a 7-year-old's welfare. It was reasonable to gather information. She moved her morning routine back by 30 minutes so she could be downstairs when June arrived. She took calls in the kitchen sometimes, where she could see the back hallway. Once, when she was supposed to be reviewing a partnership deck, she found herself watching through the kitchen doorway as June sat cross-legged on the floor next to Cleo's art table and said nothing for a full 10 minutes. Just there, present, while Cleo drew. It was the most effective thing Lyra had seen anyone do in 11 months. She didn't know what to do with that. What she did was work harder, the way she always did when something unsettled her. She added 2 more morning calls to her schedule and agreed to a conference she'd been declining for months and flew to Houston for a keynote that her communications team had been trying to get her to accept since spring. She was good at the work. The work had never let her down. She came home from Houston on a Friday afternoon to find Cleo sitting at the kitchen table with June, both of them looking at something spread out between them. Cleo heard the door and looked up, and for a half-second something opened in her daughter's face. Something quick and warm and unguarded, and then it went back to careful. "Mom," Cleo said. "Hey, baby." Lyra set her bag down and came over. On the table were 2 sheets of paper covered in pencil sketches, small figures, a house, a tree with something in it that might have been a bird or a cat. "We were making a story," June said. "Cleo's drawing. I'm doing the words." Lyra looked at the figures. One of them was clearly Cleo, the way the hair was drawn, the size. Another was smaller, a cat maybe. Another was taller, a woman with a long coat. "Who's this one?" Lyra asked, pointing to the tall figure. Cleo looked at it. "That's you," she said. "You're bringing the cat home." "I didn't know we were getting a cat. We're not. It's a story." Cleo looked at her with her father's expression, the one that said, "Keep up. In the story, we have a cat." Lyra sat down at the table. "What's the cat's name?" Cleo picked up her pencil and considered. "Gerald," she said finally. "That's a very serious name for a cat. He's a very serious cat." It was the longest conversation they'd had in months. June had quietly moved to the other end of the table and was not looking at either of them. Lyra made a mistake in November. She knew it was a mistake before she did it, which didn't stop her. There was a gala, a technology leadership event, that she attended every year and that Marcus had always come to with her. And this year she had planned not to go, and then 3 board members had called in 2 weeks to ask if she'd be there, and she was Lyra Monroe, and she went. She asked June to stay late. June said of course. She came home at 11:15. The house was quiet. She expected June to be in the kitchen or the study, but the downstairs lights were all off, except for the one in the hallway, and when she went upstairs, she found the door to Cleo's room open, all the small lamp on the nightstand burning, and June was sitting in the chair by the window, with a book open in her lap, asleep. Cleo was asleep too, but she'd clearly fallen asleep mid-conversation. She was on her stomach with her head turned toward the chair, her hand out like she'd been reaching for something. Lyra stood in the doorway. The room was very quiet. Outside, the oak tree was still against the cold sky. She went back downstairs and sat in the kitchen and looked at nothing for a while. Then she got up and made 2 mugs of tea, because her hands needed something to do. When she heard June's footsteps on the stairs, she had the mugs on the table. June stopped at the kitchen doorway. "I fell asleep," she said. She sounded neither embarrassed nor defensive, just factual. "I know," Lyra nodded at the other chair. "Sit down." June sat. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "What were you talking about?" Lyra asked. June was quiet for a moment, not deciding whether to tell her. Lyra could tell the difference. Just deciding how. "She asked me if people who die can still see the people they love," June said. Lyra was still. "I told her I didn't know. That some people believe they can, and some people don't, and that it's one of those questions nobody has a certain answer to." She thought about that for a while, and then she said. June paused. She was looking at the mug. "She said she thinks her dad is still watching her drawings. She said he would have liked the one with Gerald the cat." Lyra looked at the table. There was a small scratch near the edge from when Cleo had dragged a stapler across it last spring, before Marcus died, when life was the kind of thing you could scratch up without thinking. "She talks to you," Lyra said. It wasn't an accusation. She didn't know exactly what it was. "Sometimes," June said. "She doesn't talk to me like that." June looked at her then, directly, with a steadiness that Lyra associated with people who were not afraid to say hard things. "She loves you," June said. "She's being careful with you. She thinks if she shows you how sad she is, she'll make you more sad. She's been trying to protect you." Lyra pressed her lips together. "She's 7, she said. "Yes," June said. "She is." They sat at the table with their tea until the mugs were empty. June left at midnight. Lyra sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, not looking at anything, her hands flat on the table, breathing. She didn't cry, but when she finally stood up and turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs, she stopped at Cleo's doorway, and she looked at her daughter sleeping in the small lamplight, and something in her chest moved in a way she hadn't let it move in 11 months. She went in and pulled the covers up over Cleo's shoulder, and she stood there for a moment, and she said, very quietly, "I'm sad too, baby." Just that. Just out loud. To no one awake, "I'm sad too." She did not mean to begin looking for reasons to be in the same room as June. And yet, she started taking her morning coffee downstairs instead of in her office. She started coming home for lunch on the days she didn't have midday meetings, because June and Cleo were usually in the kitchen or the garden on those days. She started suggesting that Renata take calls from the study rather than at the kitchen table, because the kitchen table was better, for reasons she didn't examine. Her communications director called her about a profile for a business magazine in December. Lyra said she'd think about it and put the email in a folder she didn't open. On a Wednesday afternoon, she came down for coffee and found June sitting at the kitchen table with reading glasses on, working through a crossword puzzle. Just that. A newspaper crossword, a pencil, reading glasses, the ordinary middle of a Wednesday. Lyra poured her coffee and came to the table, and something made her say, "What's 8 across?" June looked up. A word for grace under pressure. She looked back at the puzzle. 6 letters. Lyra sat down. Aplom. June counted the squares. That fits. She wrote it in. She didn't say anything else, and Lyra didn't leave. And they sat at the table while the afternoon went quiet around them. It was, Lyra would think later, an ordinary 20 minutes. Nothing happened. They talked about the crossword and about the oak tree, which had lost its last leaves, and now looked, Lyra said, like it was thinking. June said she thought that was accurate. Cleo, coming in from the garden with dirt on her knees, said the tree was not thinking, it was waiting. And there was a difference. June asked what it was waiting for, and Cleo said, the spring, obviously, and went to wash her hands. Lyra watched her daughter go. Then she looked at June, who was watching Cleo go too, and smiling at the doorway even after Cleo had gone through it. She thought, I am in trouble. Then she thought, no, this is not that. You have a functioning mind, use it. She was in trouble. The clarity of it came on a Thursday in January, when Cleo got a fever, and June stayed late and then stayed later. And at 10 o'clock at night, after Cleo had finally fallen into a real sleep, Lyra came downstairs and found June at the stove making soup with whatever was in the refrigerator, and the kitchen smelled like garlic and thyme, and Lyra stood in the doorway in her socks and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Then she could name it. It was this: the lit kitchen. The sound of something cooking, someone in the house who was here because they chose to be here. Not because they were on the schedule, not because the agency required it, but because a child was sick and they were staying. It had been a long time since anyone had simply stayed. She went in and got a glass of water and stood at the counter and watched June stir the soup. She was aware that she was not being very subtle about watching. She was also aware that she was too tired to care. You don't have to stay, she said. I know, June said. She didn't look up from the pot. Lyra drank her water. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet and cold, and somewhere down the block, someone was coming home late, headlights sweeping across the kitchen window and then gone. I grew up without anyone staying, Lyra said. She heard herself say it and wasn't entirely sure where it had come from. My grandmother did her best, but it was a lot for one person, and sometimes things just didn't get handled. Nobody's fault. She paused. I think that's why I keep everyone on a schedule. If it's on the calendar, it gets done. June turned the burner to low and turned around. She was leaning against the counter now with her arms crossed, looking at Lyra with the kind of attention that didn't feel like evaluation. You've been handling everything, June said. Someone has to. That's true, June said, and you're doing it. She tilted her head a little, but you're allowed to let some of it be hard. Lyra looked at the window. The headlights were long gone. I know that, she said. I don't think you believe it, though. Lyra was quiet. She was aware that she should probably say something that ended this line of conversation. Something efficient. Something that moved things back to the professional arrangement they were supposed to be in. She did not say any of those things. "I keep thinking I missed something," she said. "Before he died. Something I should have caught. He had a checkup in September. Everything was fine, and 4 months later." She stopped. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the counter. "I keep thinking, what did I miss?" June was very still. "You didn't miss anything," she said quietly. "You know that. I know it, and I don't believe it. You identified that distinction earlier." Something passed across June's face. Not quite a smile, but close. "That's fair," she said. They stood in the kitchen, and the soup simmered on the stove, and eventually June got 2 bowls from the cabinet and filled them both. And they sat at the table and ate soup at 10:30 at night without turning on any more lights. And the quiet in the kitchen was different from the quiet Lyra had been living in for the past year. It was not the quiet of absence. It was just the quiet of two people who were somewhere they were supposed to be. She should have told her sooner. That was the thing she thought about later. In the way you examine a decision after you've made the wrong one. She should have said something before it had gotten to the point where not saying anything was its own kind of dishonesty. But she was Lyra Monroe, and she had built a 17-year career on the principle that you did not act on information until you had processed it completely, and she was still processing. What happened was March. A Saturday morning, raining, Cleo at a birthday party for a classmate. The house unusually quiet. June had come in to help with some things Lyra was reorganizing. She had offered. Lyra had said yes, and now they were in Marcus's old office, sorting through boxes that had been sitting there since February of the previous year. It was harder than Lyra expected. Not the sorting. The being in the room. She was moving a box when she found, under a stack of folders, one of Cleo's drawings from about a year before Marcus died. 3 figures, all holding hands. A small one, a tall one with a long coat, and one in the middle wearing a hat because Marcus always wore hats. She stopped. June was across the room. She must have seen Lyra stop, because she went quiet too. Lyra held the drawing and looked at it. The 3 figures were very simple, just pencil lines. The way Cleo drew when she was 6, before she'd gotten particular about details. But the hands were done carefully, the fingers distinguishable. Cleo had taken care with the hands. "I haven't been in this room since he died," Lyra said. She was talking to herself, mostly, or to the drawing. "I kept the door closed. Told myself I'd get to it." "You got to it," June said. 11 months later, things happen when they're supposed to happen. Lyra looked at her. June was standing near the bookshelf, holding a stack of folders, not pretending not to have heard, not looking away. "I need to tell you something," Lyra said. June waited. She stopped. She was Lyra Monroe. She did not fumble for words. "I am aware that my interest in your continued presence in this house has become something other than professional. I want to name that because I think it's owed to you, and because I don't want to be the kind of person who lets something sit unnamed until it becomes a problem." June was very still. "I'm not asking anything of you," Lyra continued. "Your position here doesn't change regardless of whatever this is. I want to be clear about that. And if this makes you uncomfortable, I'll contact the agency and we'll arrange a transition that works for you and for Cleo." She stopped talking. The rain was coming down steadily against the window. June set the folders down on the desk. She took a moment, a real one, not performed. "It doesn't make me uncomfortable," she said. Lyra held the drawing. "I've been here 4 months," June said, "and I've watched you hold yourself together every single morning at 6 o'clock. I've watched you sit at that kitchen table and make yourself be present, even when being present is the hardest thing you've ever done. I've watched you look at your daughter like she's everything and like you're terrified of doing it wrong." She paused. "I wasn't looking for anything when I came here, but I've been here 4 months," and she stopped. She looked at the window, then back. "It doesn't make me uncomfortable." The rain came down. Lyra set the drawing on the desk carefully, face up. Then she looked at June, and June looked back at her, and neither of them moved for a moment, and then Lyra said, I'm going to need some time to figure out what the right way to do this is. Okay, June said. I'm not good at this part. I know, June said. You're doing fine. The right way to do it turned out to be slowly. There were weeks of early mornings on the back porch, talking while the neighborhood woke up. There were evenings when Cleo fell asleep on the couch, and neither Lyra nor June moved to wake her, because it was quiet in the living room. And the quiet had become something they were building together, rather than something they were getting through. There were conversations about Marcus that Lyra hadn't had with anyone. Not his family, not her friends, not the grief counselor she'd seen twice and then stopped seeing. She talked about him with June, and it didn't feel like excavation. It felt like carrying something out into the light to let it breathe. In April, Cleo said, unprompted at breakfast, I told my teacher June lives with us. Lyra looked up. June doesn't live with us. She's here every day. Cleo turned her spoon in her cereal. That's the same as living with us. It's not technically. It's the same, Cleo said in the voice that was Marcus's voice, and looked at her mother with complete confidence and went back to her cereal. June was at the counter and did not say anything, but her shoulders moved in a way that Lyra had learned to read. I'll talk to June, Lyra said. Okay, said Cleo. That evening, after Cleo was asleep, Lyra stood in the kitchen doorway and said, Cleo has informed me that you effectively live here. June turned from the sink. What did you say? I said I'd talk to you. And what are you going to tell her? Lyra looked at her. The kitchen was lit the way it always was in the evenings, warm and slightly too bright, the way kitchens got when someone was using them. It smelled like the dinner they'd made together earlier, garlic again, and something sweet from the peaches Cleo had wanted for dessert. I'm going to tell her, Lyra said carefully, that I'd like June to stay. June was very still. If June would like to stay. June looked at her for a long moment with the dish towel in her hands and the warm light and the smell of peaches in the air. Yes, June said. June would like to stay. They were in the garden in May, all three of them, because Cleo had decided they were planting flowers. She was very specific about what kind. She had gone to the nursery with June the week before and come home with a list and a strong opinion about marigolds. The garden had not been used since Marcus died, and the beds needed clearing out before anything could go in. And so they were doing that first, the unglamorous part, pulling up dead roots and turning the soil while Cleo supervised. The oak tree had leaves again, full ones now, green and real, shaking a little in the May wind. It's not waiting anymore, Cleo said, looking at it. Lyra followed her gaze. No, she said, I guess it isn't. Cleo turned back the garden bed she was supervising and pointed at a section Lyra hadn't cleared yet. You missed that part. Thank you for the direction. You're welcome. June, working a few feet away, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Cleo looked between the two of them with an expression that was pure assessment. The look she'd been using since she was 4 years old, the one that meant she was categorizing something and deciding where it went. Are you two happy? She asked. It was the most direct question she had asked in over a year. Lyra felt it land. She looked at June, who was looking back at her, and there was something in June's expression that was open and steady and entirely itself. The way June was every morning on the porch steps. Just present, just there. Yes, Lyra said. I think we are. Cleo nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already worked out. Then she pointed at the garden bed again. Then you can finish clearing that part. And then we can put the marigolds in. And then we can have lunch. That's the plan? Lyra asked. That's the plan, Cleo said. So they finished clearing the bed, and the sun moved through the oak tree, and the marigolds went in, and the garden that had sat still all winter began again to hold living things. And after lunch, Cleo drew a picture of the three of them in the garden, and she put it on the refrigerator herself, and she didn't ask anyone whether it was good enough. She had already decided.